Welcome one and all to the ancient journey. On today's journey, the Villisca Axe Murders. But before we get started, don't forget, if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and a share. And if you're into our content, please check out the rest of the channel and subscribe. It helps grow the channel and it keeps us producing these videos. This is going to start out as a whodunit story, but it's going to end up as a how many did he do story. It's a story that's highlighted for most people by the details surrounding a horrible murder scene in the small town of Villisca, Iowa. But the story has tendrils that reach across many families in the United States, and perhaps even into Europe. It's Sunday, June 9th, 1912, in Villisca, Iowa. Lena and Ina Stillinger leave their home for church service. Their plan that day is to have a meal with their grandmother after morning service, and then return home sometime later that evening. But a neighborhood friend, Mary Catherine Moore, has asked the two girls to spend the night at her house. Before leaving for a Children's Day event at the church in the afternoon, the Stillinger girls call home and reach their older sister, Blanche. They ask to spend the night, and Blanche passes the message along to their parents. Children's Day at the church ends around 9:30 p.m. according to witnesses. Catherine Moore's mother, Sarah, coordinates the events there that night. The Moore children and the Stillinger girls participate in the events there, and the Moores, with the Stillinger girls in tow, walk home and are all inside the Moore home by around 10 p.m. Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, is an early riser, and she's a bit of a busybody as well. She's outside her home the next morning and notices that the Moores have not yet risen to start their morning chores. The Moores' chickens, usually scratching away in the yard by this point, are still inside the coop, and they're starting to complain about it. It's not long before curiosity gets the best of Mary Peckham, and she wanders over to knock on the Moores' front door. She's greeted by silence. She then goes one step further, trying to open the door, and she finds it locked. Peckham walks over to let the Moore's chickens out from their coop and places a call to Ross Moore, uncle to the Moore children and brother to their father, Josiah. Ross also receives no answer at the door, despite his pounding on the windows, and shouting loudly. He reluctantly pulls out his spare house key and opens the door. With Peckham still standing on the porch, he enters the home through the parlor and heads into the guest bedroom. There he finds the bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger on the bed. Moore falters backwards, yelling to Peckham to call the police. Villisca's peace officer, Hank Horton, arrives shortly after and searches the rest of the home. What he finds can only be described as a slaughter. A bloody axe leans against the wall in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters have been found. Josiah and Sarah Moore are dead in their bed from axe wounds, Josiah receiving so many blows from the axe that his eyes are missing. While Josiah receives the sharp end of the axe, it appears the remaining victims were hit with the blunt end of the weapon. Moore children Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul are bludgeoned about the head until their death. None of the victims appear to have been aware of what was happening except Lena Stillinger, who had some defensive wounds on her arm and was found naked from the waist down on the bed. Investigators piece the night together. They find cigarettes in the attic, indicating that the killer or killers had been in the home, hiding and waiting until the Moores came home and went to bed. The first murders appear to have been of Sarah and Josiah Moore. The Moore children were next to be murdered. The killer then moved on to the Stillinger girls, perhaps on the way out of the home, perhaps not knowing that they were spending the night in the guest room. It's not known which. And before leaving the home, the axe murderer performs several acts that to this day leave little explanation and are downright chilling. The murderer returns to all of the Moors and uses the axe to smash their faces to the point that they cannot be recognized. The killer returns to Josiah and Sarah and continues to use the axe on the two after everyone in the house is long dead. And then the killer, in a terrifying moment of cold-blooded behavior, takes the time to go back to each body. He draws up their clothing to cover their faces. With the bodies' faces covered, the killer then goes about the home and covers every mirror and window in the house with a cloth. Many cultures believe the spirit of the dead will wander a house for up to a week. It is important to cover mirrors in the home to prevent the spirit from seeing itself in that mirror. He also appears to have used a bowl of water to wash his hands in, as well as taking some bacon from the Moore refrigerator, which he ends up leaving behind. Sometime that morning, before Mary Peckham awakens, the killer leaves, using the Moore's house keys to lock the doors behind him. But by the time Mary hears those chickens griping about being locked up for so long, the killer is long gone. The investigation begins and comes up with a likely first suspect. Frank Jones is an Iowa State senator and a resident of Villisca. Josiah Moore had worked for Jones for many years at Frank's farm store before the two had a dramatic falling out. In addition, Josiah was rumored to have been having an affair with Jones' daughter, Dora, although there is not any concrete evidence to support this. Jones' daughter was known to be quite promiscuous, and was known to be so because she would arrange her affairs by phone, at a time when the local operator at the switchboard would be listening in to phone calls after patching them through. What's known for sure is that Josiah left Frank's employment to start his own farm store and rose to prominence, even taking away a very lucrative John Deere tractor dealership from Jones. The two men shared such a dislike for each other that if they were walking down the street on the same side, they would make an effort to cross to the other side so as not to have to pass too closely to each other. A long investigation into Jones divides the town and ruins his political career. Investigators tried to tie Jones to a few lackeys they believed that Jones had hired to kill the family, but nothing comes from these suspects. They turn out to have alibis. Someone who was seen at the church that night with the Moores turns into quite an interesting suspect. The Reverend George Kelly was a traveling minister who was an accused peeping Tom. Kelly confesses in court at one point to the murders, but is not ever believed by the jury. Kelly is just 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighs barely over 100 pounds. While he is an oddball and possibly a pervert, he appears too weak and too frail to have acted in a rage that the Moore murders would have required. But Kelly writes many letters to police and family members of the Moores, continuing to guess about the details of the murders. It's figured out at this point that he is mentally ill, and 2 years later he is actually arrested for sending obscene material to a woman through the mail. The woman has applied to be a secretary for Kelly, and he continues to correspond with her. In 1917, police arrest Kelly again and obtain a confession from the murders for him, which he later recants, claiming he only confessed after hours of interrogation. He is acquitted in the trial. And this is the 1900s. Remember, there are no DNA databases at this time, and there aren't any fingerprint databases to use, although fingerprints were on file in certain locations. In fact, there is so little communication between law enforcement agencies that murders very similar to the Villisca murders aren't connected at the time. Several axe murders take place along the Southern Pacific Railroad from 1911 to 1912. 9 months before the Villisca murders take place, a family is murdered and the axe left leaning against the wall in a home in Colorado Springs, Colorado. In October of 1911, a family was killed with an axe in Monmouth, Illinois, and just a week later, 5 members of a family in Ellsworth, Kansas were murdered with an axe as they slept. Just a week before the killing of the Moores and the Stillingers in Villisca, a man and his wife were killed with an axe in Paola, Kansas. In fact, the killing spree committed by this person appears to have a body count well over 50 and includes 14 separate incidents. The killer selects families who live near railroad tracks. He strikes in an ambush late at night. He uses the blunt side of the axe as well as the sharpened edge. He would cover the victims' faces, the windows in the house, and the mirrors in the house with cloth. Nothing would usually be taken from the home, and the victims were often people with few enemies and little or no means. He would lock the doors and leave in plain sight, and in many of the murders there would be some sexual aspect to the crime that involved a young girl, like the partially nude Lena Stillinger. Researchers Bill James and daughter Rachel McCarthy James point towards an immigrant named Paul Mueller as being this serial killer in their book The Man from the Train. Mueller had been the main suspect in the 1897 murder of a family in Massachusetts where Mueller had worked as a farmhand, and the family had been murdered by someone with an axe. A manhunt ensued and Mueller was never found, but he is last seen heading for the train by several witnesses. There are no known illustrations or photos of Mueller, but there is a general description that he is a short man with widely spaced teeth and wears an angry expression on his face at all times. He is a former German sailor and is known to have scars on his face and his hands as well. James and McCarthy James have attributed murders of families from 1898 up to 1912 to Mueller, spanning the states of Massachusetts, North and South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Texas, Oregon, Colorado, Illinois, Kansas, Iowa, and more. They believe his last crime may have taken place in Germany in 1922, where a family was found murdered by an axe. All of these murders share the same details. An axe was used, the location is close to rail tracks, and mirrors are left covered. The Villisca Axe Murders are officially unsolved, but the details of Mueller's rampage certainly seem to point towards him as the suspect. James and McCarthy James believe he may be responsible for many more murders. Thanks for watching, and thanks for sharing the journey.